the U.S. monetary system. The U.S. monetary system during the 20th century has dramatically changed from the one authorized by the Constitution. Only silver and gold were to be used in payment of debt, and no paper money was to be issued. In one of the few restrictions on the states, the Constitution prohibited them from issuing their own money, and they were to use only gold and silver in payment of debt. No central bank was authorized. The authors of the Constitution were well aware of the dangers of inflation, having seen the harm associated with the destruction of the continental currency. They never wanted to see another system that ended with the slogan, "It's not worth a continental." They much preferred sound as a dollar or as good as gold as a description of our currency. Unfortunately, their concerns, as they were reflected in the Constitution, have been ignored, and as this century closes, we do not have a sound dollar as good as gold. The changes to our monetary system are by far the most significant economic events of the 20th century. The gold dollar of 1900 is now nothing more than a Federal Reserve note with a promise by untrustworthy politicians and the central bankers to pay nothing for it. No longer is there silver or gold available to protect the value of a steadily depreciating currency. This is a fraud of the worst kind, the type of crime that would put a private citizen behind bars. But there have been too many special interests benefiting by our fiat currency. Too much ignorance and too much apathy regarding the nature of money. We will surely pay the price for this negligence. The relative soundness of our currency that we enjoy as we move into the 21st century will not persist. The instability in world currency markets because of the dollar's acceptance for so many years as a reserve currency will cause devastating adjustments that Congress will eventually be forced to address. The transition from sound money to paper money did not occur instantaneously. It occurred over a 58-year period between 1913 and 1971, and the mischief continues today. Our central bank, the Federal Reserve System, established in 1913 after two failed efforts in the 19th century, has been the driving force behind the development of our current fiat system. Since the turn of the century, we have seen our dollar lose 95% of its purchasing power, and it continues to depreciate. This is nothing less than theft, and those responsible should be held accountable. The record of the Federal Reserve is abysmal. Yet at the close of the 20th century, its chairman is held in extremely high esteem, with almost zero calls for study of sound money, with intent to once again have the dollar linked to gold. Ironically, the government and politicians are held in very low esteem, yet the significant trust in them to maintain the value of the currency is not questioned, but it should be. The reasons for rejecting gold and promoting paper are not mysterious, since quite a few special interests benefit. Deficit financing is much more difficult when there's no central bank available to monetize government debt. This gives license to politicians to spend lavishly on the projects that are most likely to get them reelected. War is more difficult to pursue if government has to borrow or tax the people for its financing. The Federal Reserve's ability to create credit out of thin air to pay the bills run up by Congress establishes a symbiosis that is easy for the politicians to love. It's also advantageous for the politicians to ignore the negative effects from such a monetary arrangement, since they tend to be hidden and disseminated. A paper money system attracts support from various economic groups. Bankers benefit from the float they get with fractional reserve banking that accompanies a fiat monetary system. Giant corporations who get to borrow large funds at below market interest rates enjoy the system and consistently call for more inflation and artificially low. Even the general public seems to benefit from the artificial booms brought about by credit creation, with lower interest rates allowing major purchases like homes and cars. The naive and uninformed fully endorse the current system because the benefits are readily apparent while the disadvantages are hidden, delayed, or not understood. The politicians, central bankers, commercial banks, big business borrowers all believe their needs justify such a system. But the costs are many and the dangers are real. Because of easy credit throughout this century, we have found that financing war was easier than if taxes had to be raised. The many wars we have fought and the continuous military confrontations in smaller wars since Vietnam have made the 20th century a bloody century. It is most likely that we would have pursued a less militaristic foreign policy if financing it had been more difficult. Likewise, financing the welfare state would have progressed much slower if our deficits could not have been financed by an accommodative central bank willing to inflate the money supply at will. There are other real costs as well that few are willing to believe are a direct consequence of Federal Reserve Board policy. Rampant inflation after World War I, as well as the 1921 Depression, were a consequence of monetary policy during and following the war. The stock market speculation of the 1920s, the stock market collapse of 1929, and the Depression of the 1930s, causing millions to be unemployed, all resulted from Federal Reserve Board monetary mischief. Price inflation of the early 50s was a consequence of monetary inflation required to fight the Korean War. Wage and price controls used then totally failed. Yet the same canard was used during the Vietnam War in the early 1970s to again impose wage and price controls with even worse results. All the price inflation, all the distortions, all the recessions, and unemployment should be laid at the doorstep of the Federal Reserve. The Fed is an accomplice in promoting all unnecessary war, as well as the useless and harmful welfare programs, with its willingness to cover Congress's profligate spending habits. Even though the Fed did great harm before 1971, after the total elimination of the gold-dollar linkage, the problems of deficit spending, welfare expansion, and military-industrial complex influence have gotten much worse. Although many claim the 1990s have been great economic years, Federal Reserve Board action of the past decade has caused problems yet to manifest itself. The inevitable correction will come as the new century begins and is likely to be quite serious. The stage has been set. Rampant monetary growth has led to historic high asset inflation, massive speculation, overcapacity, malinvestment, excessive debt, negative savings rate, and a current account deficit of huge proportions. These conditions dictate a painful adjustment, something that would have never occurred under a gold standard. The special benefits of foreigners taking our inflated dollars for low-priced goods and then loaning them back to us will eventually end. The dollar must fall, interest rates must rise, price inflation will accelerate, the financial asset bubble will burst, and a dangerous downturn in the economy will follow. There are many reasons to believe the economic slowdown will be worldwide, since the dollar is the reserve currency of the world. An illusion about our dollar's value has allowed us to prop up Europe and Japan in this past decade during a period of weak growth for them. But when reality sits in, economic conditions will deteriorate. Greater computer speed, which has helped to stimulate the boom of the 1990s, will work in the opposite direction as all the speculative positions unwind, and that includes the tens of trillions of dollars in derivatives. There was a good reason the Federal Reserve rushed to rescue long-term capital management with a multi-billion-dollar bailout. It was an unadulterated fear that the big correction was about to begin. Up until now, feeding the credit bubble with even more credit has worked and is the only tool they have to fight the business cycle. But eventually, control will be lost. A paper money system is dangerous economically and not constitutionally authorized. It is also immoral for government to counterfeit money, which dilutes the value of the currency and steals value from those who hold the currency and those who did not necessarily benefit from its early circulation. Not everyone benefits from the largesse of government spending programs or systematic debasement of the currency. The middle class, those not on welfare and not in the military-industrial complex, suffer the most from rising prices and job losses in the correction phase of the business cycle. Congress must someday restore sound money to America. It's mandated in the Constitution, it's economically sound to do so, and it's morally right to guarantee a standard of value for the money. Our oath of office obligates all members of Congress to pay attention to this and participate in this needed reform. Police state. A police state is incompatible with liberty. 100 years ago, the federal government was responsible for enforcing very few laws. This has dramatically changed. There are now over 3,000 federal laws and 10,000 regulations, employing hundreds of thousands of bureaucrats diligently enforcing them, with over 80,000 of the bureaucrats carrying guns. We now have an armed national police state, just as Jefferson complained of the King George in the Declaration of Independence. He has sent hither swarms of officers to harass our people and eat out their substance. A lot of political and police power has shifted from the state and local communities to the federal government over the past 100 years. If a constitutional republic is desired and individual liberty is cherished, this concentration of power cannot be tolerated. Congress has been derelict in creating the agencies in the first place and ceding to the executive the power to write regulations and even tax without congressional approval. These agencies enforce their own laws and supervise their own administrative court system, where citizens are considered guilty until proven innocent. The Constitution has been thrown out the window for all practical purposes, and although more Americans every day complain loudly, Congress does nothing to stop it. The promoters of the bureaucratic legislation claim that to have good intentions, but they fail to acknowledge the cost, the inefficiency, or the undermining of individual rights. Worker safety, environmental concerns, drug usage, gun control, welfareism, banking regulations, government insurance, health insurance, insurance against economic and natural disaster, and a regulation of fish and wildlife are just a few of the issues that prompts the unlimited use of federal regulatory and legislative power to deal with perceived problems. But inevitably, for every attempt to solve one problem, government creates two new ones. National politicians aren't likely to volunteer a market or local government solution to a problem, or they will find out how unnecessary they really are. Congress's careless attitude about the federal bureaucracy and its penchant for incessant legislation have prompted serious abuse of every American citizen. Last year alone, there were more than 42,000 civil forfeitures of property occurring without due process of law or conviction of a crime, and oftentimes the owners weren't even charged with a crime. Return of illegally seized property is difficult, and the owner is forced to prove his innocence in order to retrieve it. Even though many innocent Americans have suffered, these laws have done nothing to stop drug usage or change people's attitude toward the IRS. Seizure and forfeitures only make the problems they are trying to solve that much worse. The idea that a police department under federal law can seize property and receive direct benefit from it is an outrage. The proceeds can be distributed to the various police agencies without going through the budgetary process. This dangerous incentive must end. The national police state mentality has essentially taken over crime investigation throughout the country. Our local sheriffs are intimidated and frequently overruled by the national police. Anything worse than writing traffic tickets prompts swarms of federal agents to the scene. We frequently see the FBI, the DEA, the CIA, the BATF, the Fish and Wildlife, the IRS, federal marshals, and even the Army involved in local law enforcement. They don't come to assist, but to take over. The two most notorious examples of federal abuse of police powers were seen at Ruby Ridge and Waco, where non-aggressive citizens were needlessly provoked and killed by government agents. At Waco, even Army tanks were used to deal with a situation that the local sheriff could have easily handled. These two incidents are well known, but thousands of other similar abuses routinely occur with little publicity. The federal police state seen in the action at Ruby Ridge and Waco hopefully is not a sign of things to come, but it could be if we're not careful. If the steady growth of the federal police power continues, the American Republic cannot survive. The Congresses of the 20th century have steadily undermined the principle that the government closest to home must deal with law and order and not the federal government. The federal courts also have significantly contributed to this trend. Hopefully, in the new century, our support for a national police state will be diminished. We have in this past century not only seen the undermining of the federalism that the Constitution desperately tried to preserve, but the principle of separation of powers among the three branches of government has been severely compromised as well. The Supreme Court no longer just rules on constitutionality, but frequently rewrites the laws with attempts at comprehensive social engineering. The most blatant example was the Roe versus Wade ruling. The federal courts should be hearing a lot fewer cases, deferring as often as possible to the state courts. Throughout the 20th century, with Congress's obsession for writing laws for everything, the federal courts were quite willing to support the idea of a huge interventionist federal government. The fact that the police officers in the Rodney King case were tried twice for the same crime, ignoring the constitutional prohibition against double jeopardy, was astoundingly condoned by the courts rather than condemned. It is not an encouraging sign that the concept of equal protection under the law will prevail. And Mr. Speaker, I will yield back the few minutes I have left, and I plan to complete my special order on this subject on Wednesday evening. Thank you.
The gentleman yields back the balance of his time. Does the gentleman from Texas have a motion?
I move that the, excuse me, I move that the House now adjourn.
Thank you.